International Trade Secretary. Liz, now you're going to be thrilled that I'm actually not going to ask you how different the rules are between Newcastle and Cardiff, but I was slightly surprised when your colleague Alok Sharma said this morning on the radio that he thought it was unfair for journalists to ask ministers what the rules are. It's not unfair, is it? It's a perfectly sensible question to ask.
I think the issue is, though, that we need to focus on the big picture. Why are we doing these local restrictions? And the answer is because we don't want to have another national lockdown. We don't want the economic consequences that will bring to people's livelihoods. So the right approach is to have local restrictions dealing with COVID where it arises. So that is the point that
that seems to me to be a very powerful argument, but equally, it's only worth having those rules if people understand them.
Absolutely, and they're available
and
there.
You should know them, shouldn't you? And it's perfectly reasonable for me to say, what is the rule in your patch or the patch down the road? That's a perfectly reasonable question. It just seemed a very odd thing for your colleague to say.
I'm a great believer in the free press, and I think any question is reasonable that you might ask me, Robert. But the point is here that people can go on gov.uk, they can look up the rules in their local area. Of course, we are seeking to communicate those rules, but it's necessarily more specific and more complicated because we are taking a tactical approach dealing with the lockdown in each individual area so that we protect lives and we also protect livelihoods. So it's necessarily more complex.
No, it obviously is complicated. There are national rules and, as you say, there are regional and local rules. Only one part of England has actually come out of those lockdown rules, which is Luton. How will any of us know whether the rules are working?
Well, this is being monitored very closely by our scientists. These rules are not being invented arbitrarily. They are on the basis of the best medical advice and scientific advice.
But do you know what the criteria are? Do you, as a cabinet minister, senior member in this government, do you know what the criteria are?
So every cabinet meeting, we have a presentation from Chris Whitty and Patrick Valence talking about the absolutely latest issues. There's a specific committee of cabinet ministers, the COVID committee, that looks at that in more detail. So yes, it gets proper scrutiny across government. Those decisions are made by ministers, and that's the way it should be.
Now, I just want to follow up on something I was talking to Nick Timothy about. It is sort of extraordinary that Boris Johnson can lead your party to such a victory, and yet so many Tory MPs, including those we thought of as his, passionate supporters, have turned against him. How has it come to this?
I don't accept the premise of your question at all. We have a robust parliamentary democracy. Of course, members of parliament must make their voices heard. The government has agreed that there will be votes on key national measures where there is time to do that. Of course,
But you've been forced into doing that, hasn't he?
Of course, we had to act quickly in the initial instance of COVID. But what we have said now is that Parliament will be involved in voting where there are national measures put in place, and that's the right approach. I mean, we live in a parliamentary democracy. We expect MPs to be talking about the views of their constituents, to having that debate. I think that's healthy.
I'm sure many people would agree with you. This is a Prime Minister who, not that long ago, seemed a bit frustrated with the workings of parliamentary democracy. He has been forced by MPs against his will to do something that he didn't want to do.
I completely disagree with the premise of your question. We want to make sure that Parliament is fully engaged. We want to make sure the country is fully engaged. We want people to understand the measures we're asking them to take. We want them to understand why we're asking them to do that, which is to protect lives, but it's also to make sure that, as far as possible, we keep the economy going. And, of course, my role as Trade Secretary is making sure that we have the economic growth, we have the future opportunities, so that we can help the country.
And indeed, it's trade I now want to talk to you about, because Anushka's just got something we want to show you first.
Yeah, let me show you a tweet earlier this month from Joe Biden, who's obviously hoping to be president in a few weeks. He said, "We can't allow the Good Friday Agreement that brought peace to Northern Ireland to become a casualty of Brexit. Any trade deal between the US and UK must be contingent upon respect for the agreement and preventing the return of a hard border period."
So that was a pretty critical statement from Joe Biden about the legislation you've just passed. You must presumably want Trump to win on that basis.
We are absolutely committed to the Good Friday Agreement. And before I talk about the US presidential election, I also think it's important to point out that we're absolutely committed to our food standards. There's been a lot of chat about various issues, and some campaigners seem to be campaigning against things that are already illegal in Britain, like chlorinated chicken and hormone beef. But I want to be very clear
will you
that we will not lower our standards.
Will you accept the House of Lords amendment to that bill which talks about maintaining those standards?
It's not necessary because it's already illegal. I do find it slightly bizarre that there's a campaign running against things that are already illegal in this country.
Anything wrong with
we
belt and
won't
braces?
lower food standards.
But anyway, on that point, though, surely since Biden has plainly said that he's anxious about what's being done by your government, you'd rather have Trump, wouldn't you?
We're working with both parties in the United States. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are in strong support for a trade deal with the UK. We already have a massively positive economic relationship. We've got 1 million Brits working for American companies, 1 million Americans working for British companies. And we are committed to the Good Friday Agreement. And I will work with whoever is in the White House, with whichever administration it is, because this is about more than who is the president. It is about a very strong relationship with our closest ally and friend, with whom we've got a huge amount in common.
But you, as Equalities Minister, must have been horrified last night when President Trump refused to criticise white supremacists.
Well, I'm afraid I haven't had time to catch up with the debate yet, Robert.
I can assure you that's what happened.
It's going to be weekend watching. And, of course, you know, I am completely committed to the equality agenda here in the UK, and I'll watch it for myself. But it is not our job as ministers in the UK to intervene in foreign politics. Our job is to bat for British interests. We've just seen the first shipment of UK beef, go to the United States for the first time in 23 years, getting that beef ban lifted. What my job is to help British farmers, help British manufacturers get their products around the world, help us recover from the COVID crisis. But it's not my job to interfere in politics in other countries.
No,
I think that's a dangerous game.
But let's talk, therefore, about a domestic issue. Now, your Conservative MP colleague, Crispin Blunt, accuses you of lacking empathy for trans people, and he says, on that basis, you should give up your role as Equalities Minister.
Well, what I want to see is a country where trans people are free to live their lives, free to thrive and prosper. And what we've done in the resolution we've come to on the Gender Recognition Act is protect the rights of transgender people, but also protect the rights of women. And I think it's really important we strike that balance. We protect single-sex spaces, which have been hard fought for by women over generations. But also we make the process... Robert, I do want to finish on this.
But it is important.
We do want to make the process for transgender people going through transition kinder and more straightforward.
But not self-identify in the way that Theresa May wanted, for example. Not self-identify in the way that Theresa May wanted.
That's correct, because I think we need checks and balances in the system.
Finally, there's been a lot of interest in the Home Office's new approach to asylum seekers, and it's been confirmed that the government wants to essentially adopt the Australian model of processing asylum seekers offshore. Ascension Island has been mentioned, Moldova has been mentioned. Are you comfortable with that? It feels a very un-British thing to do.
I'm not going to comment, Robert, on leaks from government, but what I will say is we do have a serious issue with illegal migration, and I'm absolutely 100% behind the Home Secretary in dealing with that issue. It's the right thing to do.